I think that there was a time in my life when I read everything that was written about the Sympathizer. By that I mean not just the professional reviews, but also Amazon.com, Goodreads, all of that. And so I think I had a pretty good sense of what readers like and didn't like about that novel. And I don't think, again, the point is still subtle, that I don't think most people who didn't like the book were saying, he didn't translate to us. That's not what people are thinking. Their reactions, however, are symptomatic of not being translated to, not being catered to, starting with maybe a lack of explanation in the novel. Like there are some readers who say, I needed more explanation of the politics or the history and so on. And I refuse to do that. That's a function, that's a translating function too. Because when I pick up a Jonathan Franzen novel or any novel by a white person, I don't expect to be translated to. I don't expect to have American history or culture or politics or whatever rendered specifically for me. I know the expectation is I have to come to meet the novel. And again, for a certain percentage of readers who dislike a novel like The Sympathizer, they're not going to say that, but they're going to react in that way of people who are rendered uncomfortable because, for once, they're not being spoon-fed information that they expect minorities to give to them. And I think that I've also talked about how the novel was rejected by 13 out of 14 editors of major New York publishers. And of course, no one ever said, I'm not being catered to, but that must be one of the reasons. I think there was one editor who wrote in his rejection, I couldn't crawl into the voice. I'm like, what does that mean? But I think that was, again, symptomatic of the fact that people are making all kinds of subconscious decisions about what they like to read and don't like to read, and that made it actually fairly explicit. They want to crawl into a voice. They want to feel as if there's no friction between them and the book and the author that they're encountering. In the United States, it's clearly the case that I am a Vietnamese American or Asian American writer because very often I'll be introduced that way. Here is Viet Nguyen, the Vietnamese American writer, which I don't necessarily have a problem with. I don't have a problem with being identified as with adjectives of various kinds, and I'm a proud Vietnamese American and Asian American writer. I believe in our literary movements and our political movements and our identifications. But it is problematic if adjectives are put on me but not put on the writer right next to me, or another writer mentioned in the same article who's just simply mentioned as a writer. That's offensive, and that has to be corrected every time that happens. In the French context, for example, I think that, ironically, I'm oftentimes more seen as an American writer than I am in the United States. So usually in the French context, I will be introduced as an American writer. It's interesting how strange these shifts can be, though, because I remember walking into the department store BHV in Paris, and they have a big book section. And I found my books under a category called Anglo-Saxon literature, which I was like, well, that's interesting. And I tweeted about that, and it generated an interesting response because, of course, the medievalists were like, wait, that's deeply problematic to be put under Anglo-Saxon literature, and because Anglo-Saxon, in today's environment of racial politics, which is global, not just in the United States, Anglo-Saxon signifies something along the lines of white supremacy for certain people. What's also really important is the interviews. And so I've been fairly relentless in doing literally hundreds of interviews since 2015 and hundreds of talks in the United States and also outside of it, including in Sweden, because I think I don't have the luxury of letting my work speak for itself. If I was a white male author, I possibly could do that because of the very plausible assumption that many people around the world would know a lot about white men from the United States, simply because of American power and representation and all of that in the United States, because I've had to constantly absorb and deal with their representations of themselves. And I'm not complaining about it, it's just simply a fact. So, therefore, in my situation, I cannot simply hope that the work will go out into the world and people will be able to read it with enough context to really deal with all the nuances all of the time. So the interventions that I have to make are constant in terms of writing essays for newspapers, which do get translated into different languages, about refugees, for example, or about the war in Vietnam, or about refugees in general, as you mentioned, that people make a connection between what I'm dealing with in terms of Vietnamese refugees or Southeast Asian refugees and current refugee issues that are happening today in Europe, for example. I think for a lot of readers, American readers, white American readers, they're not used to not being translated to when they encounter something by a non-white or a person of color. And so that subtle formal shift at the novel, at the level of the novel, did have an impact on the way the novel is read, because the novel is written from one Vietnamese person to another Vietnamese person. And if you're having that kind of a dialogue, you're not going to translate stuff in that is already assumed to be the case within Vietnamese. The example that I use often is like, hey, look, an author like Jonathan Franzen, if he's describing someone eating a sandwich, he never has to say a sandwich, comma, 2 slices of bread with some delicious stuff stuffed in the middle. Whereas a Vietnamese American writer is often expected to say pho, comma, a delicious beef noodle soup, comma, which we never do in real life with each other. And so when people hear that, they're like, oh yeah, of course, I do that too. Or, this is something that is an expectation put upon us. And so the subtleness of that shift is important because it indicates how deeply held the assumption is that so-called minorities in any country, in any context, are expected by the dominant culture to translate themselves constantly. And that's a position, it's enormously important to translate, obviously, in certain ways, in certain contexts, in certain ways, but not every day. That's an existential kind of problem that is a constant level of microaggression that is symptomatic of a larger level of macroaggression in which peoples of color and other marginalized populations are put in. So the refusal to translate is a very important literary and political and personal move that I try to convey explicitly when I talk to audiences, including students. My own work in the American context is deeply critical of the United States. And so when the work is translated outside of the United States and I am cast as an American author, I'm aware that I'm still an American and that there is this American imperialism that is brought along with me. That's what I meant earlier when I said that myself being an American writer writing in English is radically different than being a Vietnamese writer writing in Vietnamese in terms of the reach of my work, and it's because of imperialism. And that's a paradoxical situation to be in because on the one hand I'm being critical of the United States, but I'm also being given a platform to speak in these other international situations because I'm an American, being critical of the United States. And of course, countries like France absolutely are interested in the critique of American imperialism. So there's very few places I can think of that are innocent of the baggage of nationalist expectations and preoccupations. The reason why genre is very important in both The Sympathizer and The Committed is because I love genre. I love detective novels and science fiction and fantasy, even though those don't come into play in these 2 books. And, the other reason why the question of genre is so important to me is because I'm basically, like The Sympathizer, divided into 2 selves. There's a high-minded self and a low-minded self, and so the high-minded self is apparent in these books because of their literary allusions or philosophical musings, all that kind of stuff, and the ambitions for writing a novel that would be, a modernist kind of work. But at the same time, I'm very low-minded in the sense that I like being entertained. I like genre stories, I like action, I like sex and drugs and violence and all that kind of stuff in my stories. And so it was just a natural reflex to impulse to put the genre elements into the novel. I wanted to capture readers, entertain them, and obviously, my belief is that by entertaining them, I could also then introduced to politics and the satire more easily. I've read a lot of works of political literature that, for example, have no sense of humor, no sense of entertainment, and so on. And, I may agree with their politics, but the works are not very entertaining and therefore not very widely read. And so the hope, again, is that I will seduce readers into, reading a novel that is fun to read and then hit them with the serious stuff. We, the unwanted, wanted so much. We wanted food, water, and parasols, although umbrellas would be fine. We wanted clean clothes, baths, and toilets, even of the squatting kind, since squatting on land was safer and less embarrassing than clinging to the bulwark of a rolling boat with one's posterior hanging over the edge. We wanted rain, clouds, and dolphins. We wanted it to be cooler during the hot day and warmer during the freezing night. We wanted an estimated time of arrival. We wanted not to be dead on arrival. We wanted to be rescued from being barbecued by the unrelenting sun. We wanted television, movies, music, anything with which to pass the time. We wanted peace, love, and justice, except for our enemies, whom we wanted to burn in hell, preferably for eternity. We wanted independence and freedom, except for the communists, who should all be sent to re-education, preferably for life. We wanted benevolent leaders who represented the people, by which we meant us, and not them, whoever they were. We wanted to live in a society of equality, although if we had to settle for owning more than our neighbor, that would be fine. We wanted a revolution that would overturn the revolution we had just lived through. In sum, we wanted to want for nothing. What we most certainly did not want was a storm, and yet that was what we got on the seventh day. The faithful once more cried out, "God, help us!" The non-faithful cried out, "God, you bastard!" Faithful or unfaithful, there was no way to avoid the storm, dominating the horizon and surging closer and closer. Whipped into a frenzy, the wind gained momentum, and as the waves grew, our ark gained speed and altitude. Lightning illuminated the dark furrows of the storm clouds, and thunder overwhelmed our collective groan. A torrent of rain exploded on us, and as the waves propelled our vessel ever higher, the faithful prayed and the unfaithful cursed, but both wept. Then our ark reached its peak, and, for an eternal moment, perched on the snow-capped crest of a watery precipice. Looking down on that deep, wine-colored valley awaiting us, we were certain of two things. The first was that we were absolutely going to die, and the second was that we would almost certainly live. Yes, we were sure of it. We will live. And then we plunged, howling, into the abyss.